Hey everybody, my name is Brendan Noble, and I'm a fantasy author. Welcome back to my Slavic Saturday series, where we talk about different things in Slavic mythology, history, and folklore related to my Slavic fantasy series called the Frostmarked Chronicles, and then the first book in the series, A Dagger in the Winds. This week, we're going back to the theme of demons and spirits in Slavic mythology with a spirit of the water called the Wodnik or the Vodyanoy. But before I jump too far into the Wodnik, I just wanted to remind you that the first book in my series, A Dagger in the Winds, I am looking for advanced readers for it. Advanced readers are people that receive a free copy of the book in exchange for an early review on Amazon or your favorite retailer. If you're interested in potentially doing that, check out the links down in the description below. But now let's dive into the Wodnik. Now, if you've been paying attention to my channel for some time, the Wodnik might sound similar to the Topielic or Utopiek, or the Drowner that we've talked about before. And this makes sense. The Utopiek is a demon of swamps and bogs, and the Wodnik, as a spirit of the water, would potentially form a similar role. And in some countries, they kind of did. Both were often creatures that drowned people, and both were often considered demons in some regions. But especially among the West Slavs, particularly in Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Slovenia, these were often considered two different creatures. One that was more a spirit of the water, and one that was particularly a demon of the water. And we'll go into the differences between those. A key difference between these two creatures as well is that while the Utopiek was almost always considered negative, I would say always considered negative, it was called a drowner for a reason, because it drowned people, and that always is going to have a negative perception. The Wodnik often did this as well, so it did have a very negative perception often, but in some stories it occasionally could be a helper. So there's this interesting contrast as well, and it could appear sometimes as a demon and other times as a spirit, and this is different because a spirit was often considered a protector of a certain area, and the Wodnik could be a protector of a certain body of water. And in some stories, what this meant was that if the Wodnik drowned someone in this body of water, they became the Utopiek. So it was almost a hierarchy of demons or spirits, or whatever you really want to call them, that was caused by the Wodnik's protection of an area. In many countries as well, they both share elements of this idea of a drowner, where they would capture people and drown them in the water, regardless of whether it's Utopiek or Wodnik. And a good example of this appears in the Witcher stories, whether the stories themselves or the video games. The English version of the Topielec in the video games is the Drowner. And the Drowner, again, is this Utopiek or Topielec, but while the Witcher stories as well have a Wodnik or Vodyanoy, which are creatures that would live under the water in the deep sea by themselves, having their own cities. And this probably is based on the Polish interpretation a lot of the Wodnik, which would be that they lived under these bodies of waters, building crystal palaces made of either crystal or ice or various other things on the bottom of a body of water. So while The Witcher itself isn't a perfect basis for mythology, it interprets mythology, and it's an interesting way to see it, how it appears in popular culture. And I have to agree that in some ways these two demons or spirits, or whatever you want to call them, are different, and I agree with that interpretation that appears in The Witcher because of that. And so when it comes to appearances, while the Utopiek was often a slimy, kind of beastie looking creature, the Vodyanoy or the Wodnik had various different appearances depending on the region. Some could look more like a Utopiek, some had a more frog-like appearance, often in Eastern Slavic countries especially. You'd have big buggy eyes, often red eyes that were gleaming, sometimes green eyes, but regardless, other times he would appear as an old man, wearing red clothing, almost always wearing red clothing. And either if it was the frog-like form or the human form, he had webbed fingers and other sometimes more aquatic-like features that could differentiate him from another person. That being said, he could be a shapeshifter, just like many spirits and demons in Slavic mythology, so his appearances could vastly vary from aquatic animals to land animals to the things we talked about, to a man even with a merman's tail. So there's a lot of different stories that appear, and they appear very differently across a lot of the Slavic countries because there is so many different bodies of water. I think he brings on different epitomes of and things of different areas and what people thought of creatures that could appear in that area, and it all kind of comes together as this overarching creature that has many subdivides within it. Many stories as well of the Wodnik come from mill owners or people that lived by the water, because they would have these big mill wheels and the Wodnik would tend to mess with them. So what people would try to do is give offerings to the Wodnik to prevent it from being angry. The problem is, if the Wodnik is angry, it was known to attack and drown people. And the Wodnik as well, some areas was thought to have children of his own, and the only way for him to apparently find a spouse for his children was to drown either an eligible woman or eligible man to be the spouse of his children. So the thought is as well, though, that if you give them the animals or a different type of sacrifice, potentially you can keep them away. And this occurred in many different regions, particularly in Poland as well. This is one of the reasons that they thought would keep it away. In the Ukraine, they thought that if you buried a horse's skull by the water or beneath a dam around it, that would help keep the Wodnik away as a kind of protective thing. In Belarus, oddly enough, it was thought that if you buried a black rooster beneath the mill's doorway, that could help protect it. And they also kept black animals such as black cats and black roosters as well within the mill itself to be protective, because again, in Slavic mythology, black tends to not be a negative color. It sometimes is actually a protective one. And Russia actually has its own twist on the Wodnik, with the Wodnik actually having a czar among them, and his name was Tsar Vodyanoy. And this czar and his other Wodniks would be beneath the ice during the winter, and come the end of the winter months, he would emerge and with the other Wodniks and cause problems among people along the coast of either ponds or rivers or lakes. So there's some speculation about what the exact role in mythology of the Wodnik was. Some think that potentially because the Wodnik was thought to appear more in late springtime, that this could relate to the time before Kupola Night, which was a fertility festival that we talked about before that occurs in mid-June. And you weren't supposed to bathe for a couple weeks ahead of Kupola Night, so potentially the idea is that the Wodnik was supposed to keep people out of the rivers from bathing. Other ideas was that the Wodnik was supposed to be this kind of spirit that was meant to represent the thing causing floods that would damage different farms, or the thing that would help people explain why people drowned in different areas when they were bathing, or other things. So he brings in this fear element of water because it was potentially a unfamiliar place for a lot of people. A lot of people didn't know how to swim, or among the early Slavs there really wasn't a heavy boating culture, so there was a chance that the waters in general could be a scary place, and the Wodnik would help be this interpretation of what would be in the waters for them, and then why people stay away from them. So now in my own stories, in the Frostmarked Chronicles, the Utopiek shows up more early than the Wodnik does, but this little element of a czar of the Wodniks is kind of a cool element that I think will probably appear later in the series. You'll have to keep your eye out for it. But know that the swamps and the waters, no matter where you go in this fantasy world, will likely hold danger, whether it's a Rusalka, whether it's a Utopiek, or whether it's a Wodnik. Things tend to be lurking within them. And that's all I have for you today on this Slavic Saturday series. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please remember to like and subscribe down below. I come out with these videos every Saturday.